In the winter of 1841, Solomon Northup vanished. Not legally, not publicly, not cleanly. He vanished in a way that unsettled everyone who participated in his disappearance and terrified those who witnessed his return. This is not the well-known story preserved in polished textbooks. This is the version hidden in margins. The version pastors refused to preach. The version plantation families locked away in trunks and burned before their deaths. Because Solomon Northup did not simply escape slavery. He came back with knowledge. And knowledge, in certain centuries, was more dangerous than rebellion. Those who claimed to have seen him after his escape described something wrong in his eyes. Not madness, recognition. As if he had seen the machinery beneath American life and survived it. Church bells rang out of rhythm in towns he passed through. Children woke screaming his name without ever having heard it. Ledgers corrected themselves overnight. And somewhere deep in Louisiana, men began digging graves without bodies. This documentary is a descent, not into blood, but into systems. What you are about to hear was assembled from fractured testimonies, sealed church minutes, family confessions written on deathbeds, and one orphanage registry that ends abruptly in the year 1843. What Solomon escaped was not just bondage. It was a design. Before the night Solomon Northup was taken, he was known as a man who remembered too much. He was educated, literate, musical, a violinist whose performances unsettled certain audiences, not because of skill, but because of what people felt while listening. Witnesses described an unplaceable unease during his music, as though the notes carried memories that did not belong to the room. In Saratoga Springs, he played at church socials, inns, and private homes. And at every gathering, there was always one person who left early, quietly, as if summoned. In later church minutes, these individuals are described only as listeners who felt called away. In March of 1841, Solomon was approached by two men claiming to be entertainers. Their names shift across records, sometimes Merrill and Brown, sometimes simply the partners. They offered him work. But here is what no public record emphasizes. Before Solomon accepted, he hesitated. Not because of money. Because, according to a handwritten letter later found among his wife's belongings, he told her, "They speak as if they already know me, as if I have been counted." That word, counted, appears again and again in plantation inventories, church tithe logs, and orphan registries across the South. People were not sold. They were counted. Solomon disappeared shortly after traveling with the men to Washington City. Officially, he was drugged, shackled, and sold. Unofficially, there are church documents that list his arrival 3 days before he entered the slave pen. And someone signed for him using a symbol instead of a name. A symbol found carved into pews, pulpit undersides, and coffin lids throughout the region. 3 vertical lines. One broken. The plantation where Solomon was sent was not remarkable in size, but it was obsessive in documentation. Every birth, every death, every confession. Plantation owners recorded sermons delivered to enslaved people, word for word. These sermons were never meant for salvation. They were meant for conditioning. Repeated phrases. Call and response obedience. Scripture rearranged until it no longer resembled faith. Solomon was assigned a new name. But witnesses later testified he never responded to it. Instead, he listened. He listened to the rhythms of control, to how punishment was scheduled, to how prayers were timed. And most disturbingly, he listened to the overseer's night readings. After midnight, the overseer would sit alone in the main house and read from a ledger no enslaved person was supposed to see. It was not a Bible. It was a register of disappearances. Children sent to seminaries that did not exist. Men transferred to plantations no one could locate. Women recorded as given to the church. Solomon was beaten for watching, but he was never killed. Because according to a margin note found decades later, this one remembers. Let him. The first sign something had gone wrong came during a Sunday service. Solomon was ordered to play music during the sermon, but instead of hymns, he played something older. Not African, not European. Something built from repetition and fracture. The congregation grew uneasy. Children cried. The preacher lost his place repeatedly. And then, according to 3 separate testimonies, Solomon stopped playing and spoke. Not loudly, not angrily. He said, "You have miscounted." The sermon ended early. That night, the plantation dogs refused to leave their kennels. The overseer locked the ledger away for the first time in 20 years. and a woman who had been listed as dead walked out of the cane fields at dawn, unable to explain where she had been for 7 years. From that moment on, Solomon was no longer just enslaved. He was monitored, because the system had encountered something it was never designed to hold. A man who could see it. The plantation church stood at the edge of the property, half swallowed by moss and shadow. From a distance, it appeared ordinary. Whitewashed wood, a bell tower that leaned slightly east, a cross that had been repaired so many times it barely resembled itself. But this church was not built for worship. It was built for accounting. Inside, beneath the floorboards, were compartments, long, shallow spaces used to store ledgers wrapped in oilcloth. These records were not kept with plantation documents. They belonged to a different authority altogether. The sermons delivered here were written elsewhere. Every word spoken from the pulpit arrived by courier, sealed, and signed. Pastors were not allowed to alter them. In fact, most pastors did not understand them. They recited phrases whose meanings had been hollowed out and replaced with obedience cues. Solomon noticed immediately. He noticed that certain words caused physical reactions, heads lowering, shoulders tightening, hands clasping unconsciously. The congregation did not believe these sermons. They responded to them. During one service, Solomon watched an elderly man stand suddenly and walk out, tears streaming down his face. No one followed him. No one asked why. Later that evening, Solomon overheard the man speaking to the pastor behind the church. "I have been counted again," the man said. "I cannot survive another transfer." The pastor did not console him. He simply opened a ledger and nodded. That night, the man disappeared. Official records list his death as natural causes. Church records list him as relieved. Solomon began to understand the system's true power. It was not the whip. It was not the chain. It was language. Names were removed first, then histories, then witnesses. Entire lives were dissolved into phrases like reassigned, converted, and given to the church. The church was not a refuge. It was a transfer point. Solomon noticed something else. Every person who disappeared had first been isolated spiritually. They were labeled troublesome, questioning, or unfit for instruction. And then they were taken somewhere no plantation map acknowledged. During choir rehearsals, Solomon was placed near the pulpit. From there, he could see faint markings carved into the wood, symbols matching those found in the overseer's ledger. 3 vertical lines, one broken. The same symbol appeared beside certain names in church baptismal records. Those names never appeared again. Solomon began memorizing them. He memorized dates, routes, phrases repeated before disappearances. And something else began happening. People started coming to him at night. Quietly, desperately. They asked him questions he was never supposed to hear. Do you know where they take us? Can a name be returned? Can a person come back wrong? Solomon never answered directly. He listened. And the more he listened, the more the system faltered. 30 miles away, hidden behind a grove of cypress trees, stood an orphanage. On paper, it housed dozens of children. In reality, it was empty. Church records showed constant activity, admissions, transfers, religious instruction. But when a census taker visited in 1842, he recorded only one caretaker and no residents. The caretaker refused to speak. Later that year, Solomon was sent to assist with a delivery near the orphanage. This was not punishment. It was surveillance. They wanted to see what he would notice. And he noticed everything. The building was clean but unused. Beds untouched. Clothing neatly folded but unworn. But in the basement, he found something else. Rows of small wooden tags. Each one etched with a name. Some of those names belonged to adults Solomon knew. Others belonged to children who had vanished years earlier. The caretaker watched him closely. "You should not read those," the caretaker said. Solomon replied calmly. "They are already read." That night, the caretaker burned the tags. 2 days later, the orphanage closed permanently. Official reason: lack of funds. Unofficially, too many names had been remembered. From that moment on, events accelerated. The church stopped sending sealed sermons. Transfers were delayed. Ledgers went missing. Most disturbingly, people began returning. Not publicly, not fully. Men who had been declared dead appeared on distant plantations, unable to explain how they arrived there. Women spoke of being kept in places with no windows, no seasons, and no names. They described being told repeatedly, "You have already been counted. You are no longer required to be whole." Solomon listened to these accounts and recognized the pattern. This was not random cruelty. It was administrative, a system built to move human beings like inventory until something disrupted the count. And Solomon was that disruption. He did not resist with violence. He resisted by remembering. And memory, once restored, could not be easily removed again. By late 1842, whispers about him had reached beyond the plantation. Not rumors of rebellion, but warnings. There is a man who sees the records. There is a man who breaks the count. There is a man who should not survive transfer. Orders came down quietly. Solomon Northup was to be removed. Not sold. Not punished. Removed. But the system made one fatal mistake. It waited. The seminary was introduced to the surrounding towns as a place of moral refinement. A brick building, newly raised, funded by donations that appeared simultaneously across several counties. Each gift recorded in identical handwriting. It had classrooms. It had dormitories. It had a chapel. It had no students. Solomon learned of it from a man who returned from religious instruction, unable to remember his own surname. The man repeated one sentence over and over, as if trained. They have relieved me of the burden of lineage. Solomon understood immediately. This was where the missing were processed, not killed, rewritten. Through labor arrangements, Solomon was sent to assist with repairs at the seminary. The request came from the church, not the plantation, a rare breach of protocol. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves. Not bookshelves, record shelves. Thousands of slim ledgers, each bound in gray cloth, each marked with dates rather than names. Solomon opened one. Inside were entries written in 2 columns. The left listed original identities. The right listed outcomes. Not destinations. Outcomes. Dissolved. Reassigned. Retained. And beside a small number of entries, very few, was a symbol Solomon had not seen before. 3 vertical lines. All intact. Those entries were marked. Unresolved. Solomon closed the book. Someone had been watching him. The chapel inside the seminary was never used for public worship. There were no pews. Instead, there were chairs bolted to the floor in a circle. In the center was a lectern carved with familiar symbols. But the broken line was missing. This place was not about erasure. It was about containment. Solomon witnessed a session. A woman was let in. She was clean, calm, and eerily compliant. She was asked questions, not about belief, but about memory. Do you recall your mother's name? No. Do you recall the sound of your childhood home? No. Do you recall ever resisting? No. Each answer was written down. Not what she said, but how quickly she said it. Then came the final question. Do you wish to be counted again? She hesitated. The room went still. Solomon felt it. The pressure, the expectation, the silent demand. I do not know, she said. That hesitation earned her the intact symbol. She was unresolved. Solomon realized then what the system feared most. Not escape. Indecision. People who could not be finalized. Solomon did something no one expected. He waited. For weeks, he memorized routines. Guards. Locks. Delivery schedules. But most importantly, he memorized where the ledgers were stored. Then, on a night when storms erased the horizon, Solomon acted. Not to destroy. To rearrange. He moved ledgers from one shelf to another. He swapped outcomes. He returned names to dates they no longer belonged to. It was not sabotage. It was confusion. By morning, the system no longer knew who had been counted. Transfers halted. Churches received conflicting instructions. Seminary staff argued over which records were correct. And in that confusion, people slipped through. Not escaped, unnoticed. Solomon did not flee. He stayed long enough to see the panic. Because systems built on control collapse when certainty is removed. The response was swift and silent. An auditor arrived. Not a plantation owner. Not a preacher. A man with no recorded origin. He carried a personal ledger bound in black. He spoke directly to Solomon for the first time. You have complicated matters, the man said calmly. Solomon replied, you made them fragile. The auditor offered him a choice. Compliance in exchange for comfort. Or transfer into permanent resolution. Solomon asked a single question. How many have you lost? The auditor did not answer. Because the number was increasing. That night, Solomon vanished from the seminary. Officially, he was reassigned. Unofficially, the system had lost track of him entirely, which should have been impossible. When Solomon Northup disappeared from the seminary, no alarms were raised. Because the system did not yet understand what had happened. Records showed him reassigned. Church minutes confirmed transfer approval. Plantation inventories reflected his absence as expected. On paper, Solomon still existed. In reality, he had stepped into a space the system could not see. People later described it as an escape. But escape suggests motion away. What Solomon did was something else. He moved between. For weeks, he traveled without a name. He avoided roads, churches, and plantations. Instead, he followed places where records broke down: marshes, burned towns, abandoned chapels. In those places, people survived without being counted. They recognized Solomon immediately, not by face, by behavior. He did not ask where he was. He did not ask who owned the land. He asked only one question: who here has been forgotten? And people answered, because forgetting had become a form of violence. Solomon carried names with him, not written, not spoken aloud, but held. He refused to let them dissolve again. The system noticed something was wrong when people it believed resolved began appearing elsewhere, unregistered, untracked, legally impossible. The count no longer matched the bodies. And that discrepancy was unacceptable. They did not send slave catchers. They sent clerks, men trained to correct anomalies. These men traveled with ink, not chains. They visited courthouses, churches, and orphanages, correcting ledgers quietly. Wherever Solomon had passed, the clerks arrived days later. But something strange occurred. The records would not hold. Corrections reverted overnight. Names returned after erasure. Outcomes changed on their own. In one town, a clerk reportedly burned an entire register in frustration. That night, every church bell rang at once. Witnesses said the sound felt accusatory. The clerks realized too late that Solomon was no longer alone. People had learned what he knew. They began refusing transfers, refusing sermons, refusing to answer questions about memory. Indecision spread, and indecision was contagious. In early 1843, representatives from churches, plantations, and seminaries convened. There are no official minutes, only fragments from private letters. The discussions centered on one problem. How do we finalize a man who refuses to be finalized? Some argued for removal by force. Others warned that killing Solomon would create witnesses. The most senior voice proposed something else. Let him return. Publicly. Legally. Let him speak. And then, let history dilute him. This was containment through narrative. If Solomon returned as a single man with a story, the system could survive. But if he returned as proof of structure, it would not. Solomon Northup reappeared in the north as if summoned. Documents resurfaced. Affidavits aligned. Witnesses remembered. It looked like justice. But those who had tracked the system knew better. This was a controlled release. Solomon testified. He wrote. He named individuals. But he never named the structure. Because he understood something crucial. If he exposed everything, the system would erase it all again. So he chose a different path. He told enough truth to survive. And carried the rest quietly. Those who met him after his return described a man permanently listening, never fully present, always measuring what was being counted. When asked what he wanted now, Solomon reportedly said, to remain unresolved. After Solomon Northup returned and told his story, the public believed the danger had passed. A book was published. Lectures were given. A narrative was accepted. And then, something strange happened. Solomon faded. Not violently. Not mysteriously. Administratively. Invitations stopped arriving. Mentions of his name became less frequent. Newspapers referred to him in the past tense while he was still alive. This was the final function of the system. Not erasure, but dilution. If a truth is repeated without its structure, it becomes harmless. Solomon understood this better than anyone. That is why he stopped speaking publicly. That is why he refused to clarify certain details. Because every time someone asked him, why did they do this? He gave the same answer. Because it worked. And that answer frightened people more than anger ever could. Years later, orphanages reported something unsettling. Children who could not read or write began carving symbols into desks and walls. 3 vertical lines. One broken. They could not explain where they learned it. Some claimed a man visited them in dreams, not to rescue, but to remind. He told us our names were still ours, one child said. Seminaries quietly closed. Churches revised their sermons. Records were simplified. The system adapted, but it never fully recovered, because it had been seen. and once seen, it could never return to invisibility. Solomon Northup's later life is poorly documented. This is often described as a historical failure. It was not. It was intentional. He avoided institutions. He avoided churches. He avoided ledgers. He lived among people who did not count one another. When asked to recount his experiences again, he refused. History already knows enough, he said. But privately, he continued his work. Not activism. Not rebellion. Instruction. Teaching people how to recognize systems that require forgetting to function. Teaching them how to remain unresolved. Today, records remain incomplete. Names still vanish. Institutions still count people in ways that strip them of meaning. And yet, every system built on total control carries a flaw. It cannot tolerate memory. Solomon Northup did not destroy a system. He exposed its limits. He showed that escape is not always movement. Sometimes, escape is refusal. Refusal to be simplified. Refusal to be finalized. Refusal to be forgotten. And that is why this story was buried. Not because it was too violent, but because it was too precise. Because it showed that even the most carefully built machinery of control can be undone by a single man who remembers.